The pencil trembled slightly in his weathered hands as he sketched the display case in front of him. Visitors walked past without a second glance at the elderly man hunched over a worn notepad in the corner of the World War II wing. His clothes were simple, unremarkable, a faded cardigan over khaki pants, scuffed shoes that had seen better decades. To everyone around him, he was just another retiree killing time at the museum on a Tuesday afternoon. But something about his sketches was different. While other visitors snapped quick photos or read plaques with casual interest, his pencil moved with surgical precision across the paper. Each line deliberate, each shadow calculated. He wasn't drawing what he saw on display, he was drawing from somewhere else entirely, somewhere deeper than memory should reach. The museum curator, Dr. Sarah Chin, noticed him during her afternoon rounds. She'd seen countless visitors over her 15 years here, but something made her pause. The way he held his head, the intensity in his eyes as he stared not at the artifacts, but through them, as if seeing something no one else could see. When she glanced over his shoulder at the notepad, her breath caught. The sketch wasn't of the museum display. It was a detailed blueprint of a bunker system, complete with measurements, tunnel layouts, and strategic positions marked with military precision. At the bottom corner, in the same steady handwriting, were coordinates and a date, June 6, 1944. D-Day. And suddenly, Dr. Chin realized she wasn't looking at a casual sketch. She was looking at classified intelligence drawn from the memory of someone who had been there. Welcome to Silent Salute, where we uncover the extraordinary lives hidden behind ordinary moments. Before we continue with this incredible story of memory, courage, and forgotten history, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you believe that stories like this deserve to be remembered and shared, please hit that subscribe button. We're building a community that honors the unsung heroes among us, and your support means everything. The National Museum of Military History stood like a fortress of remembrance in the heart of downtown, its limestone walls holding decades of stories within glass cases and carefully curated displays. It was the kind of place where school groups shuffled through on field trips, where tourists checked items off their must-see lists, and where history felt safely contained behind velvet ropes and protective barriers. Dr. Sarah Chin had dedicated her career to preserving these stories, ensuring that the sacrifices of previous generations remained visible to those who had never known war. The elderly man had been visiting for 3 weeks straight, always arriving when the museum opened at 9, always sitting in the same corner near the Normandy exhibition. He never spoke to anyone, never asked questions, never seemed interested in the guided tours that passed by every hour. He simply sat, sketched, and stared at displays with an intensity that made other visitors uncomfortable without understanding why. Staff members had begun to notice him. The security guard mentioned he was harmless but strange. The volunteer docents whispered that he seemed to know more about the exhibits than the placards revealed. One visitor had complained that his sketching was distracting, that museums weren't meant for amateur artists taking up space. But Dr. Chin had something different stirring in her academic instincts, a feeling that this man represented more than met the eye. His name, according to the visitor registry he signed each morning, was simply Robert Hayes. No address, no phone number, just a signature that looked like it belonged to someone accustomed to official paperwork. He arrived by public bus, carried the same worn leather satchel, and never stayed past closing time. To most people, he was invisible. To Dr. Chin, he was becoming a mystery she couldn't ignore. The sketches themselves were what captured her attention most intensely. From a respectful distance, she had observed him drawing not the museum pieces themselves, but intricate diagrams that seemed to emerge from nowhere. Structural layouts that bore no resemblance to the static displays. Maps with topographical details that weren't visible in any of the museum's materials. Technical specifications that appeared to be drawn from direct experience rather than second-hand observation. On his 4th Wednesday visit, Dr. Chin decided to approach him. She had prepared a casual conversation starter about his artistic interest in military history, expecting to engage with a retired hobbyist or perhaps a veteran with general service experience. What she discovered instead would challenge everything she thought she knew about the museum's most quiet and unassuming visitor. When she looked over his shoulder that afternoon, the sketch spread across his notepad showed a detailed cross-section of German fortifications at Omaha Beach. Not the simplified diagrams from history textbooks, but architectural precision that included drainage systems, ammunition storage locations, and structural weak points that had never been included in any public documentation she had ever seen. The measurements were exact. The defensive positions were marked with tactical symbols she recognized from classified military documents. Robert Hayes looked up at her with eyes that held depth she hadn't expected. They weren't the vague, unfocused eyes of someone drawing from imagination or textbook memory. They were sharp, calculating, and carried the weight of someone who had seen these places not as historical sites, but as active battlefields where decisions meant the difference between life and death. The room around them continued its normal rhythm. School children moved past in organized lines, their teacher explaining the significance of D-Day in broad educational terms. Tourists snapped photos of medals and uniforms behind glass. Audio guides provided sanitized narrations of historical events. But in the corner where Robert Hayes sat with his notepad, history wasn't sanitized or distant. It was immediate, precise, and personal in ways that made Dr. Chin's academic training feel suddenly inadequate. She realized she was looking at something unprecedented in her 15 years of museum work. Not just a visitor with casual interest, not even a veteran with general service stories, but someone whose memory contained details that official histories had never recorded. Someone who didn't need to read the museum placards because he had been there when the events they described were happening in real time. Robert continued sketching as if her presence didn't matter, as if the sketches were compulsions rather than choices. Each line he drew seemed to unlock another detail from memories that most people his age could barely maintain about what they had for breakfast. But these weren't breakfast memories. These were tactical intelligence memories. These were memories of places where young men died and decisions were made under circumstances most people could never imagine surviving. Dr. Chin stood behind him, watching pencil strokes that seemed to rebuild bunkers and command posts from decades past. And slowly, she began to understand that the quiet man in the corner wasn't just sketching historical interest. He was documenting personal experience. He was drawing from a memory bank that contained classified information, tactical knowledge, and first-hand observations that existed nowhere else in the world. The implications of what she was witnessing began to settle over her like a slowly dawning realization. If Robert Hayes could draw these fortifications with this level of detail, if he could remember drainage systems and structural specifications that weren't included in any public records, then he hadn't learned about D-Day from books or documentaries. He had been there. Not as a tourist, not as a historian, but as someone whose job it was to know these details with life and death precision. As she watched him work, Dr. Chin found herself looking not at an elderly museum visitor, but at a living piece of history whose memories contained intelligence that military historians would pay fortunes to access. Someone whose presence in her museum wasn't casual coincidence, but perhaps a final attempt to document experiences that would disappear forever when he was gone. Robert Hayes finished the bunker cross-section and turned to a fresh page. Without looking up, he began sketching what appeared to be a beach landing approach, complete with tidal calculations and defensive fire zones marked with the kind of tactical precision that could only come from someone who had studied these approaches not in books, but in preparation for actual assault operations. Dr. Chin realized she was witnessing something extraordinary. Not just artistic talent, not just good memory, but the active recollection of classified intelligence by someone who had carried these details through 79 years of life without ever speaking about them publicly. Someone whose silence wasn't forgetfulness, but operational security that had become such an ingrained habit that even in old age, even in the safety of a public museum, he communicated through sketches rather than words. The afternoon visitors continued their casual museum experience around them, unaware that they were sharing space with someone whose memory contained first-hand knowledge of events they were viewing through display cases and historical placards. School children learned about D-Day from textbooks while sitting 20 feet away from someone who had been there when the invasion was planned, executed, and survived. Dr. Chin knew she was standing at the intersection of living history and institutional preservation. Everything her career had taught her about maintaining historical accuracy, everything her training had emphasized about verifying sources and documenting provenance, was being challenged by an elderly man whose sketches contained information that official records had never captured. She also knew that whatever Robert Hayes carried in his memory, whatever experiences had given him the ability to draw classified fortifications from personal recollection, he wasn't sharing this information accidentally. His visits to the museum weren't casual retirement activities. They were deliberate, purposeful, and carried the weight of someone settling accounts with history before it was too late. The question facing Dr. Chin was no longer whether Robert Hayes was an interesting museum visitor. The question was whether she was prepared to handle the implications of discovering that her museum's most quiet guest might be one of the last living repositories of intelligence that had shaped the outcome of World War II. As Robert Hayes continued sketching, Dr. Chin made a decision that would change both their lives forever. She was going to find out exactly who this man was, and more importantly, she was going to ensure that whatever knowledge he carried would be preserved before time claimed another witness to history that the world couldn't afford to lose. But first, she had to approach him carefully. Because if her suspicions were correct, if Robert Hayes really was who his sketches suggested he might be, then she was dealing with someone who had spent nearly 8 decades keeping secrets that could rewrite military history. And people who carry secrets that long don't give them up easily, even to museum curators who believe they understand the value of historical preservation. The sketching continued. The museum visitors continued their casual tours, and Dr. Chin prepared to have a conversation that would reveal whether the quiet man in the corner was just an artistically talented retiree, or whether she had discovered one of the most significant living historical resources of her professional career. Robert Hayes turned another page and began sketching what appeared to be a communication bunker with radio equipment layouts that matched no historical documentation she had ever seen. And Dr. Chin knew she was about to learn something that would change everything she thought she understood about the museum's mission to preserve military history. The pencil moved with mechanical precision across the paper, each stroke revealing details that existed nowhere except in the memory of someone who had been trusted with information that could determine the fate of nations. And slowly, Dr. Chin began to understand that she wasn't just observing casual museum sketching. She was watching classified history being documented by the only person alive who remembered it firsthand. When Robert Hayes finally looked up from his notepad and made eye contact with Dr. Chin, she saw something in his expression that confirmed her growing suspicions. Not the mild confusion of someone interrupted during hobby sketching, but the measured assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating whether classified information could be safely shared. Someone whose default response to questions was operational security rather than casual conversation. He closed the notepad slowly, deliberately, like someone securing classified documents rather than putting away personal artwork. And Dr. Chin realized that whatever conversation they were about to have, it would require the kind of careful trust building that happens between people who understand that some stories are too important to tell carelessly, and too valuable to take to the grave in silence. The afternoon light filtering through the museum windows caught the silver in Robert Hayes' hair and the intelligence in his eyes that had been hidden behind decades of careful silence. And Dr. Chin prepared to discover whether she was speaking with a museum visitor or with a living piece of classified history that had been sitting in her museum's corner, sketching secrets that could rewrite everything she thought she knew about World War II. The conversation that followed would reveal not just who Robert Hayes was, but why he had chosen her museum, why he had chosen this moment, and why after 79 years of silence, he was finally ready to let someone else see the memories he had carried alone since 1944. But that conversation would also reveal something Dr. Chin hadn't expected. That preserving history isn't just about maintaining artifacts and writing placards. Sometimes it's about recognizing that the most important historical documents aren't stored in archives. Sometimes they're stored in the memories of elderly men who sketch classified intelligence in museum corners, waiting for someone knowledgeable enough to understand what they're seeing and trustworthy enough to handle what they're about to learn. Dr. Chin took a deep breath and approached Robert Hayes with the careful respect she would show to any priceless artifact. She pulled up a chair beside him, close enough to see his work but far enough to avoid seeming invasive. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Robert continued sketching what appeared to be a detailed map of underground tunnel systems, complete with measurements that suggested intimate familiarity with subterranean military architecture. Finally, Dr. Chin broke the silence with a question that had been building in her mind for weeks. She asked him how he remembered such specific details about fortifications that weren't included in any public historical records. Robert paused his sketching, looked at her with eyes that seemed to be evaluating whether she could handle classified information, and then did something unexpected. He smiled. Not the polite smile of a museum visitor being questioned by staff, but the weary smile of someone who had been waiting decades for the right person to ask the right question. He told her that he hadn't learned these details from books or documentaries. He had learned them because his job during World War II had been to know them well enough to keep other people alive. Robert Hayes, it turned out, had been a reconnaissance specialist with the Office of Strategic Services, the predecessor to the Central Intelligence Agency. His assignment had been to gather intelligence on German fortifications along the Atlantic Wall, information that would be crucial for planning the D-Day invasion. For months before June 6, 1944, he had worked behind enemy lines, documenting defensive positions, mapping bunker systems, and identifying weak points that Allied forces could exploit during the invasion. The sketches he was drawing in the museum weren't artistic interpretations of historical events. They were intelligence reports, drawn from memory by someone who had risked his life to gather the information firsthand. The bunker cross-sections, the tunnel layouts, the defensive positions marked with tactical precision, all of it came from reconnaissance missions he had conducted while German soldiers were actively occupying those positions. Dr. Chen realized she was sitting next to a man who had literally helped plan one of the most significant military operations in human history. Someone whose intelligence work had contributed directly to the success of D-Day, whose reconnaissance had helped save thousands of Allied lives, and whose contributions had remained classified for so long that even he had never spoken about them publicly. But Robert's story contained layers that went deeper than individual heroism or military service. As he continued talking, Dr. Chen learned that his reconnaissance work hadn't ended with D-Day. He had continued gathering intelligence throughout the European theater, documenting German military installations, communication networks, and strategic positions that Allied forces would need to understand as they advanced toward Berlin. His memory contained not just tactical intelligence, but human intelligence. Stories of French resistance fighters who had risked their families to help him gather information. Details about German soldiers who had shown unexpected mercy to captured civilians. Observations about how war affected communities in ways that official histories had never recorded because they focused on military strategy rather than human experience. The sketches spread across his notepad represented more than classified intelligence. They represented the intersection of military necessity and human courage, drawn by someone who had witnessed both the strategic planning that won battles and the individual sacrifices that made victory possible. Robert Hayes hadn't just been a participant in history. He had been a documenter of history, someone whose job required him to observe and remember details that others might miss or forget. Dr. Chen asked him why he had chosen to visit the museum, why he had decided to start sketching these memories after decades of silence. Robert explained that he was 88 years old, that he was one of the last people alive who carried this particular intelligence, and that he had become concerned about what would happen to this information when he died. Official records, he told her, contained sanitized versions of events that emphasized tactical success while minimizing the human cost of gathering intelligence. The classified documents that did exist focused on strategic outcomes rather than operational details. But his memory contained information that existed nowhere else. Details about how intelligence was actually gathered, how reconnaissance missions were conducted, and how individual decisions made by unknown soldiers had influenced major historical events. The museum visits weren't casual retirement activities. They were Robert's attempt to document intelligence that would otherwise disappear forever when he died. He had been sketching these memories because he hoped someone knowledgeable enough to understand their significance would eventually notice and ask the right questions. Someone who could help ensure that this information would be preserved for future historians and military analysts. Dr. Chen understood that she was facing an unprecedented opportunity in historical preservation. Robert Hayes wasn't just offering her personal war stories or general military reminiscences. He was offering her access to classified intelligence that could provide unique insights into how World War II was actually fought at the operational level. Details that could enhance understanding of military history in ways that academic research alone could never achieve. But she also understood that handling this information would require careful consideration of security protocols, historical accuracy, and ethical responsibility. Robert had spent nearly 8 decades keeping these secrets because they involved other people's lives, other people's families, and operational details that could still have national security implications even 79 years later. The conversation that followed lasted until the museum closed that evening. Robert shared details about reconnaissance missions that had never been documented in official histories. He described German fortifications that Allied intelligence had identified as crucial vulnerabilities. He explained how individual decisions made by reconnaissance specialists had influenced tactical planning for major operations. But he also shared personal memories that revealed the human dimension of intelligence work. Stories about sleeping in French barns while German patrols searched nearby roads. Memories of resistance fighters who had provided crucial assistance despite knowing that capture meant death for their entire families. Observations about how war affected civilian populations in ways that strategic historians had never recorded because their focus remained on military outcomes rather than human experience. As the museum closed and other visitors departed, Dr. Chin and Robert Hayes remained in conversation near the Normandy exhibit, surrounded by official displays that suddenly seemed incomplete compared to the first-hand intelligence he was sharing. She realized that everything her museum had been trying to preserve, the artifacts, the documents, the historical narratives, represented only a fraction of what actually happened during the war. Robert's memory contained the missing pieces, the operational details that connected strategic planning to tactical execution, the human intelligence that explained how abstract military objectives had been translated into specific missions conducted by individual soldiers whose names appeared in no history books but whose work had influenced the outcome of major battles. When the museum security guard approached to let them know the building was closing, Dr. Chen asked Robert if he would consider working with the museum to document his memories more systematically. She explained that his intelligence could provide unique historical insights that would benefit military historians, intelligence analysts, and anyone trying to understand how World War II was actually fought at the operational level. Robert agreed, but with conditions that reflected the operational security training that had governed his entire adult life. Any documentation of his memories would need to be handled through proper channels that could evaluate security implications. Any information that involved other people's identities or operational details that might still be classified would need to be reviewed by appropriate authorities before being released to historians or researchers. Dr. Chen agreed to these conditions because she understood that preserving historical accuracy required respecting the security protocols that had protected this information for nearly 8 decades. She also understood that Robert's willingness to share his memories represented a unique opportunity that might never be available again, given his age and the rarity of surviving intelligence specialists from World War II. Over the following months, Dr. Chen worked with Robert Hayes to document his memories through a process that balanced historical preservation with security considerations. They developed a systematic approach to recording his intelligence that allowed him to share operational details while protecting information that might still have security implications. The sketches that had first caught Dr. Chen's attention became the foundation for a comprehensive documentation project that recorded not just Robert's memories, but his analytical insights about how intelligence work had influenced major military operations. His ability to remember tactical details, combined with his understanding of how those details had fit into larger strategic objectives, provided perspectives on World War II that existed nowhere else in historical records. But the project also revealed something unexpected about the relationship between individual memory and historical preservation. Robert's sketches weren't just accurate reproductions of classified intelligence. They were personal documents that reflected how individual experience had shaped understanding of major historical events. His memory contained not just factual information, but emotional knowledge about what it felt like to gather intelligence under circumstances where mistakes meant death. The documentation process showed Dr. Chen that preserving history isn't just about collecting artifacts or maintaining accurate records. Sometimes it's about recognizing that the most important historical information exists in the memories of people who participated in events rather than just observing them. Sometimes it's about understanding that official histories capture strategic outcomes while missing the operational details that explain how those outcomes were actually achieved. Robert Hayes had spent 79 years carrying intelligence that existed nowhere else in the world. His decision to share this information with Dr. Chen represented more than personal reminiscence or historical interest. It represented a recognition that some knowledge is too important to disappear when its carriers die, and that preserving this knowledge requires finding people who understand both its significance and the responsibility that comes with handling classified historical information. This story was brought to you by Silent Salute. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Tell us in the comments what they meant to you and how you remember them. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.